As the sun sank beneath the skyline at JFK International Airport, the terminals were awash in a golden hue. The airport buzzed with activity as travelers hurried toward their gates, eager to settle into their seats for journeys spanning the globe. Among them was Jonathan Carter, a tall, sharply dressed man in his late 30s, pulling a sleek leather suitcase behind him. Jonathan was a successful executive, recognized for his keen insights and leadership in the business world. His rise from humble beginnings to leading multi-million-dollar enterprises was nothing short of extraordinary. Yet today, his mind was far from his career. After an exhausting week negotiating a major merger that would redefine global aviation, all Jonathan wanted was to relax on his flight to London, where his new executive team awaited him. He glanced at his boarding pass once more. Seat 2A, business class. Jonathan was no stranger to these trips. While the allure of first class was always present, he found the comfort and practicality of business class perfectly suited his needs. As he neared the gate, he noticed the passengers ahead being greeted warmly by the flight attendants, their faces lighting up with welcoming smiles. When his turn came, Jonathan handed over his boarding pass with a nod of acknowledgement. The gate agent scanned it, glanced at the screen, and offered a brief, polite smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter," she said, returning his pass. Jonathan stepped into the jet bridge, the cool, subtly scented air of the plane embracing him as he entered. Another flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s, greeted him with a practiced yet friendly smile. Her eyes briefly flicked over him, and her smile tautened before she quickly resumed her professional demeanor. "Good evening, sir. Your seat is just down the aisle to the left." Jonathan thanked her and made his way to seat 2A, a spacious leather chair with a blanket neatly folded and a glass of champagne resting on the armrest. He exhaled in relief, sliding his carry-on into the overhead bin before sinking into the seat. After days of grueling meetings, he was more than ready for a peaceful, comfortable flight across the Atlantic. He took a sip of the champagne, appreciating its crisp flavor, and pulled out his tablet to catch up on emails. The cabin was mostly empty, and the atmosphere felt serene. The steady hum of the engines lulled him into a state of contentment. Just as he was about to lean back and close his eyes, a shadow fell across him. Looking up, Jonathan saw the same flight attendant standing beside him, her smile now replaced with a look of hesitation. "Excuse me, sir," she began cautiously. "Could I see your boarding pass again, please?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow, surprised. He had already shown his pass at the gate, and none of the other passengers seemed to be having any issues. Without questioning her further, he handed over his boarding pass. The flight attendant studied it closely, her eyes moving back and forth between the pass and the seat number, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. There seems to be a problem," she muttered softly before returning the pass to him. Jonathan frowned, sitting up straighter. "A problem? What kind of problem?" The flight attendant hesitated, glancing nervously around the cabin as if searching for assistance. "It appears this seat isn't actually available. There was a system error, and it seems has been reserved for another passenger," she finished, her voice tense. Jonathan stared at her, disbelief washing over him. "But my boarding pass says 2A. I was assigned this seat when I checked in." Her expression shifted, becoming more condescending than apologetic. "Yes, I understand, sir. Unfortunately, the system made an error. We're going to need you to move to economy class." Jonathan just blinked, incredulous. "You're asking me to move to economy because of a system error?" She nodded, her posture stiff. Yes, sir. It's an unfortunate situation, but we need you to move. I'm sure you'll still be comfortable back there." Jonathan felt a familiar frustration creeping in. He had been in situations like this before, times when people questioned whether he belonged, but this felt different. He had paid for his seat, just like everyone else in business class. "I'm not moving to economy," he said firmly, though still controlled. "I paid for this seat, and my boarding pass confirms that. There's no reason for me to move." The flight attendant's expression hardened. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but we really need your cooperation." "I'm not moving," Jonathan repeated, his patience waning. "If there's been a mistake, it's not on my end. I suggest you find another solution." Nearby passengers began to take notice. Some glanced over curiously, while others awkwardly avoided eye contact. The flight attendant's face flushed slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention. "Please, sir," she urged, "we don't want to escalate this situation." Jonathan stood his ground. "If there's a problem, you can take it up with the gate agent or your supervisor, but I'm not going to be downgraded because of your system error." The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll speak to the cabin manager," she replied, her tone sharp, before turning on her heel and walking briskly away, leaving Jonathan simmering in his seat. His mind whirled, frustration and disbelief tangling together. It wasn't the first time he'd felt out of place in a luxury environment, but it still stung. Would this be happening if he looked different? A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, accompanied by a man in a dark uniform, a cabin manager. The manager approached Jonathan with a stiff, professional demeanor, though his expression was more guarded. "Good evening, sir. I've been informed of the situation. Unfortunately, there's been a technical issue with the seating arrangements. We're going to have to ask you to move to economy class. We'll offer you a voucher for the inconvenience, of course." Jonathan took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not moving. I paid for this seat and have every right to stay here." The cabin manager's face tightened slightly, but he maintained a steady tone. "I understand your position, Mr. Carter, but we're dealing with a full flight. This seat was mistakenly double booked, and we really need your cooperation." "So, the seat was double booked, and I'm the one being asked to move?" Jonathan challenged. The manager hesitated, and Jonathan could sense the unspoken reasoning behind it. They just wanted to resolve the situation smoothly. The tension in the air was thick, and Jonathan could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze. He had worked too hard, come too far to be treated like this, to feel like an outsider in a space he had earned. "I'm staying right here," he said quietly, but with firm resolve. "If there's an issue, I suggest you find another way to resolve it." The cabin manager's patience was wearing thin, but before he could respond, another flight attendant approached. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, concern evident on her face. The cabin manager shot her a warning glance, but she ignored it and stepped closer. "Yes, we're just having a little issue with the seating arrangements," he replied, trying to downplay the situation. The younger attendant looked at Jonathan, then back at the manager. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said calmly, pulling out a tablet. She quickly scrolled through the passenger list, and after a few moments, her eyes widened. "Actually, Mr. Carter's in the correct seat." The cabin manager blinked in disbelief. She handed him the tablet, pointing to a section on the screen. "There's no error. Mr. Carter's seat was never double booked." For a moment, silence settled over the cabin. The manager's face flushed with embarrassment as he looked between the screen and Jonathan. The so-called system error was nothing more than a mistake, or perhaps something worse. The younger attendant turned to Jonathan, her tone apologetic. "I'm so sorry for the confusion, Mr. Carter. You're absolutely in the right seat. There's no need for you to move." Jonathan gave a curt nod, though the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. "Thank you," he replied, his voice tight. The cabin manager opened his mouth as if to say something but hesitated, ultimately nodding stiffly before retreating toward the galley, the flight attendant following close behind. As they walked away, Jonathan leaned back in his seat, trying to let go of the lingering frustration. It was a small victory, but it left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had worked hard to get where he was, and yet, even in this space, on a plane, in a seat he had rightfully earned, he was still made to feel like he didn't belong. But, as the plane lifted off and the cabin lights dimmed, Jonathan allowed himself to relax, knowing that in just a few days, when the ink dried on the contracts, this airline would be his. The next time he boarded one of these planes, there would be no question of where he belonged. He would make sure of it. Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories shared here are original and created with the intention of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue, with respect for diversity and the dignity of all individuals.